Two networks, two completely different blueprints, and yet, somewhere inside the world's largest financial institutions, the same two names keep appearing on the same internal documents, and nobody is explaining why. There's a pattern forming in the shadows of the digital asset market that almost nobody is talking about openly. While retail traders argue about candles and short-term price action, a quieter conversation is happening behind closed doors, inside compliance departments, inside treasury desks, inside the rooms where infrastructure decisions are made years before the public sees them. And in that quiet conversation, two names keep surfacing again and again: XRP and HBAR. Not as speculation, not as bets, as infrastructure. The number one question I keep receiving is simple: why are these two assets being mentioned together by people who normally don't agree on anything? Why are enterprise architects, payment specialists, and tokenization desks suddenly running parallel pilots on networks that, on the surface, look nothing alike? And why is none of this being explained to retail investors the way it should be? Welcome back. I am the calm analyst. Today, we pull back the curtain on what is quietly being called the most asymmetric repricing setup in the digital asset market. A structural shift involving XRP and HBAR that mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing. No hype, no price guarantees, just the math, the mechanics, and the signals the institutions are leaving in plain sight, if you know where to look. Let's jump in. Let's start with the hard truth. The overwhelming majority of investors are staring at the wrong screen. They're watching daily price charts, hoping for green candles, refreshing their portfolios every few minutes, and they're missing the actual story playing out underneath. To understand why a repricing event is even being discussed for XRP and HBAR, you have to understand a concept that almost no one explains to retail: dual-layer institutional positioning. The financial system, as it exists today, is not built on a single layer. It runs on two: a settlement layer and a coordination layer. Settlement is where value actually moves. Coordination is where the rules, the data, the identity, and the compliance logic live. For decades, both layers have run on aging, fragmented infrastructure: SWIFT messages, nostro-vostro accounts. Reconciliation files pass between institutions like paper memos in a digital world. What's quietly being assembled right now is the replacement of both layers simultaneously. XRP is being positioned as a settlement asset, a neutral bridge designed to move value across borders without locked capital sitting idle in correspondent accounts. HBAR is being positioned as a coordination layer, a high-throughput, enterprise-grade ledger built for the data, identity, and tokenization rails that institutions need to actually run regulated operations on-chain. This is why the two names keep appearing together. They are not competitors. They are not redundant. They are being evaluated as complementary components of the same infrastructure stack. And once you see that, everything else starts to make sense. The partnerships, the silence, the patience of long-term holders, and the strange disconnect between price and progress. Retail investors see two crypto assets. Financial architects see two pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, replaces trillions of dollars of legacy infrastructure. The gap between those two views is exactly where asymmetric opportunity lives. Let's do the math that the retail crowd ignores. Global cross-border payment volume is approximately $150 trillion annually. The foreign exchange market processes around $7.5 trillion every single day. Sitting idle inside the correspondent banking system, in nostro-vostro accounts that exist solely to pre-fund liquidity, is an estimated $27 trillion of trapped capital. That capital earns nothing. It serves no productive purpose. It exists only because the legacy plumbing is too slow to settle in real time. Now consider the supply side. XRP has a fixed cap of 100 billion tokens. Roughly 55 to 57 billion are in circulation. Escrow releases occur monthly, but the vast majority are relocked. Exchange reserves, according to on-chain data tracked by analysts at Glassnode and CryptoQuant, have been steadily declining as tokens move into custody wallets and OTC desks. The float available to the open market is shrinking, not expanding. Here's the math. If even a fraction of 1% of that $27 trillion in trapped nostro-vostro capital begins to settle on demand through a neutral bridge asset, the throughput required is staggering. And throughput, in a fixed supply system, is a function of price. The higher the per-unit value, the fewer tokens are needed to settle a given transaction, the less slippage occurs, and the more efficient the system becomes. This isn't a prediction, it's a design requirement. Now layer HBAR on top. The Hedera network is architected to process tens of thousands of transactions per second, with sub-second finality and predictable low fees. Enterprise tokenization, a market that BlackRock's Larry Fink has publicly called the next major evolution of financial infrastructure, is projected to reach into the trillions over the coming decade. Estimates range from $4 trillion to $16 trillion depending on the source. A coordination layer capable of handling that volume at enterprise-grade reliability is not optional, it's mandatory. If you have a problem with these numbers, you don't have a problem with me. You have a problem with the size of the markets these networks are being positioned to serve. The math is the math. While retail investors are panic selling on every red candle, the institutional signal has never been clearer. Look at what is actually happening, not what is being said on social media. Ripple has spent the last several years executing a deliberate acquisition strategy, bringing prime brokerage, treasury management, and custody capabilities in-house. These are not the moves of a company hoping for a payments contract. These are the moves of a company building the entire stack a regulated institution would need to operate on-chain at scale. Ask yourself, does a firm sign multi-year NDAs and acquire prime brokerage infrastructure without absolute legal certainty about where the regulatory framework is heading? They don't gamble, they position. On the Hedera side, the governing council reads like a directory of enterprise heavyweights. These are not anonymous crypto teams. These are organizations with compliance departments, board oversight, and reputational risk that would never allow them to participate in a network they did not believe had a long-term institutional future. The presence of these names is itself the signal. Then there are the broader macro signals. Spot ETF flows across major digital assets have shown consecutive periods of net positive institutional inflows. Regulatory clarity initiatives, the Digital Asset Clarity Act discussions in the United States, the Japan FSA's evolving stance, the European MICA framework already in force, are systematically removing the legal ambiguity that has kept the largest pools of capital on the sidelines. This isn't retail FOMO. This is calculated positioning by custodians, market makers, and treasury desks who have access to information flows that retail simply does not see. When BlackRock, Fidelity, and Franklin Templeton expand their digital asset infrastructure, they are not chasing a trend. They are building the on-ramps for capital that has been waiting years for permission to enter. The window we are currently in is defined by a specific sequence of catalysts, and each one removes a barrier that has historically capped institutional participation. First, regulatory clarity. The Digital Asset Clarity Act and the parallel reclassification discussions inside the SEC framework are the final green light for a category of institutional capital that legally cannot touch ambiguous assets. Once an asset is formally classified outside the security framework for secondary market transactions, the risk premium that has artificially suppressed its valuation evaporates. That repricing happens fast, because it is not driven by sentiment. It is driven by mandate. Second, the tokenization wave. Major asset managers have publicly committed to bringing tokenized funds, tokenized treasuries, and tokenized real-world assets onto public ledgers within defined timelines. The infrastructure decisions for these products are being finalized now, not later. When those products launch, the underlying networks they settle on will see structural demand that is independent of crypto-native trading activity. Third, the macro liquidity cycle. Central bank policy is shifting. Discussions inside the IMF and among major reserve managers about diversification away from single currency dependency are no longer fringe conversations. Neutral bridge assets, assets that belong to no single sovereign, become structurally interesting in that environment in a way they have never been before. When these three catalysts converge, the wait-and-see capital becomes the all-in capital. And the transition from one to the other does not happen gradually. It happens in steps. We are moving from an era of abundance into an era of structural scarcity, and most retail investors will not recognize the shift until it is already complete. Consider what is happening underneath the surface. Exchange reserves for XRP have been trending toward multi-year lows. Tokens are migrating into institutional custody wallets, multi-signature vaults, and long-term cold storage. Once a token enters one of those vaults, it does not come back to the open market for a 10% profit. It is removed from circulation, effectively permanently, until the entity holding it has a strategic reason to deploy it. The same dynamic is forming around HBAR. As enterprise integrations expand and tokenization products go live, the network's native asset gets pulled into staking, treasury allocations, and operational reserves. The float available to retail buyers shrinks quietly, day after day, while attention remains fixed on short-term price noise. The institutional playbook is not subtle once you've seen it. They spend years quietly accumulating during periods of public disinterest. They tolerate, and sometimes encourage, sideways price action because it allows them to build positions without triggering the very repricing they are positioning for. They wait for the regulatory and structural catalysts to land, and then they let the math do the rest. The door is not closed yet, but it is closing. The window where retail can accumulate alongside institutions at comparable prices is finite. Once the structural catalysts trigger, the entry point for new capital looks very different from the entry point available today. That is not a threat. It is simply how repricing events work, every single time, throughout financial history. I know how difficult the current market environment is for long-term holders. I know that watching red candles, reading bearish headlines, and seeing assets you believe in trade sideways for extended periods creates real psychological strain. That experience is not weakness. It is the cost of being early. But as an analyst, my job is to distinguish noise from signal. And the signal here has not weakened. If anything, it is strengthened, quietly, consistently, beneath the surface where most viewers are not looking. Every period of price suppression in the history of asymmetric assets has been accompanied by the same pattern: loud public skepticism, quiet institutional accumulation, and a narrative gap between what is visible and what is actually being built. The retail investors who hold through that gap are the ones who end up positioned for the repricing. The ones who break, who sell into the fear, who give up on the thesis because the timeline didn't match their patience, become the exit liquidity for the people who stayed disciplined. Being early feels exactly like being wrong, right up until the moment reality catches up. The question is not whether the structural thesis is correct. The math, the institutional positioning, and the catalyst sequence all point in the same direction. The question is, who is still holding when the gap between price and value closes? Two networks, two layers of the same emerging financial infrastructure. One quiet repricing setup that mainstream coverage is missing entirely. The market is not random. It is being structured, deliberately, by entities with longer time horizons and better information than the public discourse reflects. XRP and HBAR are not being mentioned together by accident. They are being positioned together because the institutional architects building the next layer of global financial plumbing see them as complementary, not competitive. Price is the distraction, structure is the reality, and structure, once it locks into place, does not unlock. If this analysis added clarity to how you view these two assets, leave a comment with the word infrastructure below. I want to see who actually made it to the end and understands what's being assembled. If you value calm, data-driven analysis over hype, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next.